Ukraine has wasted no time in hammering home the storm shadow threat as multiple missiles hit a Russian army headquarters in Donetsk. Ozon Warehouses, Wildberry's counterpart, has been blitzed, and the CIA director visits Moscow as Putin plans NATO provocation. I'm Philip Ingram, standing in for Jerome Starkey once again. Welcome to Frontline, your weekly roundup of the latest news on the war in Ukraine. Now we start with Storm Shadow strike on a military headquarters in occupied Donetsk on August the 26th. The strike targeted an underground parking area of an unfinished residential complex. Russian forces have been known to utilise this kind of space for command posts, with reports suggesting it could have been home to the 51st Combined Arms Army. This is actually a new group that was created in 2024, combining the 1st, the 5th, the 9th, the 110th, the 114th and the 132nd separate motor rifle brigades. Storm Shadow strike comes at a timely moment as this week British Prime Minister Andy Burnham travelled to Ukraine to announce that the UK was handing over the blueprints of the Storm Shadow, or the French version, the Scalp missile, to Kyiv. Now this is significant. And Andy Burnham visited on the 35th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. And why is it significant? Because it's sending a clear message to the Ukrainians that the support is there from the British and the French, the two countries that are leading this coalition of the willing. It's sending a clear message to the Russians that the British and French are leading a coalition of the willing and are willing to give what were, until recently, very highly classified plans to the Ukrainians. And it's saying to the rest of the coalition, including the Americans, that Europe is willing to lead the way. This is something that the British have done the whole way through this operation. Is it giving highly classified material? Is this something that's going to give the Ukrainians a huge advantage? Is it something that, if it falls into the Russians' hands, are going to cause us real problems? It's going to give the Ukrainians an advantage. Storm Shadow has been a very effective missile in its accuracy and its ability to bypass Russian air defences. However, it is over 20 years old. The technology in it is over 20 years old. So if for some reason it fell into Russian hands, they're not going to get a massive advantage. And actually, Western missiles, British missiles, French missiles have moved on from this technology. We're looking at much newer versions. It will help the Ukrainians, it'll help the geopolitics behind it, and it will scare the Russians. So there is a lot of advantages in doing this. Next, we'll run through some of the strikes on logistic warehouses. On August the 22nd, an Ozon warehouse in Tuapse in the Samara Oblast was hit by drones. And then on the August the 24th, another Ozon logistics hub in Dagestan was hit. Now this marks a sea change in Ukraine targeting, as Ozon is a direct competitor to Wildberries. Now, this is where Ukraine is attacking the wider logistic infrastructure that's supporting the Russian military on the front line. Both Ozon and Wildberries have been supplying military-type material to troops before they get deployed. It is also an import-export hub for dual-use components coming from China and elsewhere to build the FPV drones that are being used by the Russians on the front line. And it's a logistics hub that the Russian military have used to move the logistics around the country. In addition, it provides the Russian people with their equivalent of Amazon and Amazon rivals. So their prime deliveries are not getting in. But within that, there's a lot of businesses are being run, and those business stocks are being held in the Ozon and the Wildberries logistics hubs. However, their CEOs have declared this as a force majeure. That means that there is no insurance. And when that stock gets burnt down, those businesses lose everything. They are mortgaged to the Russian banks, as are Ozon and Wildberries. Russian banks are now concerned that the amount of debt that they're seeing being burnt in front of them, not able to be serviced by the businesses continuing, is getting to a point where even those banks may collapse. How do we know this? Because the Russian central bank has stepped in to try and suggest that banks should not start foreclosing on the loans that they had given. This is having a massive effect on the Russian economy, will have a greater effect as there are more attacks that go in. It is bringing the war to the Russian people, but it's also impacting that supply chain of getting capabilities down to the front line. So it's tick, 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 tick from a Ukrainian perspective. And then finally, Kotovsk in Tambov on the 25th, a Wildberries warehouse was also decimated. As these hubs continue to burn, Ukraine has managed to keep up the pressure on Putin's oil and gas infrastructure as well. On the 21st, the Lukoil refinery in Perm was hit. On the night of the 25th and 26th, a refinery in Kstovo, that's near Nizhny Novgorod, was hit. And it's also worth mentioning, on the 22nd, the skies were lit up above the port of Tuapse once again as drones targeted the facilities there. There was also a large explosion in the Amur gas complex on the 25th of August, killing 7 workers. Videos from the scene show widespread destruction. However, there's no confirmed reports of a drone strike. Could it have been sabotage? We just don't know yet. Now, continuing to hit the oil and gas infrastructure is attacking Russia's ability not just to supply oil and gas to its frontline troops. And there's some consternation coming in from here where it seems as if Putin has made the decision to reprioritize the supply of fuel to his frontline troops to make sure that Moscow isn't going without. That is causing real problems within his general staffs. That will continue. However, the Russian people are now seeing the shortages, and for the first time, Russia is now having to import petrol and diesel, refined products, at the same time as the products it's producing out of the remaining refineries that are left is of a much lower category. We know that because the Russian newspapers have published a warning to say that owners of cars and vehicles should check the quality of the fuel against their engine and see if it's matched before they fill their tanks. 92% octane is something we don't see in the West. We see 95 as the lowest. Modern engines are not designed to run on fuel of that low quality, and this is causing real problems across Russia. Now for some interesting videos we've seen in the past week. In a video released by the 42nd Motorised Brigade, we can see an unmanned ground vehicle on its way to resupply frontline troops. Now, a Russian drone hits the vehicle and gets stuck in it. But then the Ukrainians send another drone with a grapple hook to remove the Russian FPV drone to make sure that there's no danger to the resupply that's going on and to allow the unmanned ground vehicle to continue its mission. What a fascinating use of another drone. But clearly this is something that the Ukrainians were prepared for and they knew would potentially happen. In another video from the unmanned system forces, we can see Russian jets being hit in an airfield in Crimea. The drones reportedly took out an Su-33, a MiG-29 and an Orion strike UAV. As always, these strikes were not one way. In a barbaric attack on Zelensky's own hometown of Kryvyi Rih, 15 people were killed when a drone hit a crowded shopping centre. Russia used a deadly double tap strike to cause maximum civilian casualties. Double tap is where they send the first missile in, it explodes, the emergency services react, and whilst the emergency services are trying to save lives and extract people from under the rubble, a second missile comes in and hits, aimed at killing those emergency services. That is a war crime. And on Thursday the 27th, Russia executed one of its largest combined air attacks of the year with a combined assault of hypersonic and ballistic missiles alongside 258 drones. They hit warehouses in Kyiv and in the port of Odessa alongside several targets in Poltava and Zaporizhia. The Russians continue to hit these warehouses. Some of them are of military value. They're legitimate targets for the Russians to attack under international law. But a large proportion are purely civilian targets. They're not dual use in the same way that the Ozon and the Wildberries logistic hubs are. They're purely civilian targets. And attacking shopping centres is something that is completely unjustifiable under international law. As I said earlier, it is a war crime. Russia is not only trying to break Ukraine's defence industrial base, its military targets, but it's trying to break the will of the people. They haven't learned from history. We've also seen yet another high-ranking Russian commander assassinated on home soil. In St. Petersburg, on Thursday morning, an IED blew up, killing, as of this recording, an unnamed Russian lieutenant colonel and seriously injuring his wife. Now, this is putting terror into Russian officers that feel as if they're safe in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in their various headquarters. they're not safe. The Ukrainian intelligence services are very good, adept in these direct action missions or in recruiting local dissidents to carry them out on their behalf. Nowhere for any Russian officer, especially if they got links to the crimes that have been committed in Ukraine, are safe at all. Now to the front line. Ukraine forces are making successful counterattacks in Lyman and are close to encircling a Russian salient. They're bringing this cauldron effect. They close the outsides of the cauldron in. The Russians are caught in the middle and they can either die or surrender. And in the embattled city of Dobropillia, Ukrainian forces are making significant counterattacks from the western side of the city. Now, in the east, we're seeing certain Russian advances up around the fortress belt. We're seeing the Ukrainians making these successful counterattacks around Lyman and significant movements around Dobropillia. If we add it all together, there's probably no overall movement one way or the other. The front line is a stalemate. But that is a good thing for the Ukrainians because the stalemate comes at a cost of 1,000, 1,200 troops a day for the Russians, 39,000, 42,000 per month. This is something that the Russians cannot sustain. Finally, on August the 25th, Ozon bloggers noticed a very unusual sight. An American C-17 aircraft flying. Now, a C-17 is a big aircraft. Flying isn't unusual. It was in Latvia when it took off, but it flew towards Moscow. Soon after, CBS reported that John Radcliffe, who is the head of the CIA, was on board the plane. He was reportedly meeting with the Russian intelligence leaders. He was on the ground for only a matter of hours before he then flew back. Now, some have argued that was sooner than expected. And it was then revealed that Radcliffe was in Moscow to warn Russia about NATO provocation and further support for Iran. And it's an interesting visit. For the director of the CIA to take such an overt flight in a US Air Force C-17 Globemaster was significant. The fact that that Globemaster broadcast out over open source tracking channels that it was doing this is something that the United States wanted the world to know that he was going in. For him to go in, this is more than just normal diplomatic activity. It's significant that John Radcliffe has gone in and we haven't seen Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner, who've been the interlocutors with the Russians beforehand, anywhere near it. This is a time whenever there is a serious message being sent to the Russians. The last time this happened was whenever the director of the CIA, Burns, went to Russia to turn around to say to them in 2022 not to invade Ukraine. He wasn't listened to. So the inference we can make from this is of something of a similar seriousness. Now, for the last week, 10 days, 2 weeks, the Americans have been suggesting that the Russians could be building up to an attack against a NATO country, possibly the Baltics. In the press, we have described that attack, or people have assumed that attack is a conventional military attack. I personally think that if there's an attack, it will be something in the grey zone. It will be assassination attempts against CEOs of defence companies, potentially British defence companies, given what Andy Burnham has done in Kyiv. It could be an increase in cyber attacks, in sabotage that we've seen beforehand, in cutting undersea cables, which we've seen beforehand. All of these activities could constitute an attack. They are attacks. They had been going on by the Russians on a daily and weekly basis for the last 4 years, but we can see an increase in them. Why do I not think it would be conventional military? Couple of reasons. One, the Russians don't have spare conventional forces. They're all focused on dealing with what's happening in Ukraine. And to put a force package together to attack into Western countries would be very difficult indeed, because he'd need his best troops. That would leave him vulnerable in Ukraine. Two, an overt attack like that on a Western country would almost certainly trigger NATO's Article 5. Vladimir Putin knows that he can't win if he triggers that. He can do a lot more below the threshold of triggering Article 5 to cause real problems. And this is something that Radcliffe has probably gone in to warn the Russians not to do. And of course, when it comes to Iran and support for Iran, the Russians have been providing intelligence to allow Iranian missiles to target US interests in the Middle East. That's something that Donald Trump will be very concerned about. And it's just right and proper that John Radcliffe goes in and reads the riot act to the Russians. Whether he'll be listened to or not, we don't know. But the fact that nothing has leaked out from the Russian side or the American side as to what went on and what was discussed, again, is significant. Let's see if something develops in the coming days and weeks. So now we're on to your questions. And we've got a couple of really good questions this week. I'm looking forward to giving you my understanding from a former senior British military intelligence officer and a NATO planner. I plan operations, or I did plan operations. We get into, the first question is, if the fortress belt is only able to hold on right now, will it not catastrophically collapse once post-election mobilization pushes hundreds of thousands of more Russians into the grinder? Very, very interesting question. One I've asked myself on numerous occasions. On the fortress belt, we're talking of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk and Kostanivka, the areas of the Donbass region of the Donetsk Oblast that the Russians are wanting to capture. The Ukrainians around those cities have spent the last 2 to 3 years building their defences. They've got layered defences around them. These are real fortresses, and that's why they're nicknamed the Fortress Belt. And the defences in them are much stronger than we saw around Bakhmut or Pokrovsk. So if we look at Bakhmut and Pokrovsk, it took the Russians 18 months, 2 years to capture them. They were losing over 1,000 troops a day to do that. So 300,000 new troops coming in, untrained, going into a meat grinder. That is a maximum of 300 days worth of activity. Well, to get the smaller towns, and they were towns or townlets of Pokrovsk or Bakhmut, it took them 18 months. The Russians will run out of manpower before they can get and capture any of those cities. And they're all linked together. The defences are linked together. The Ukrainians have put an awful lot of effort into it. And why? Because they're the final defensive belt before you then get into more open areas to be able to move towards Kyiv and elsewhere. Will the Ukrainians give them up? No. Will they collapse? Well, the Russians have been saying for almost a year now that they have captured Kostanivka. They haven't. The Ukrainians are still holding significant parts of Kostanivka. The Russians are losing thousands of people a day. And one of the areas they're losing a lot of them in is Kostanivka. If they can't capture that, it's going to take them even longer. British Defence Intelligence assessed last year that it would take the Russians, at the rate of advance they were going last year, which is significantly more than they're advancing this year, it would take the Russians at least another 4 years and another 2 million casualties to capture the rest of the Donetsk Oblast and the remains of the Donbass region that's there. Has Putin got another number of years? Has he got another 2 million people? No. And this is why I think the fortress belt will hold, which is why we're seeing the Russians putting so much effort into whenever there's any talk of peace negotiations. They always say that they want this disputed Donbass region. They want the Donetsk Oblast given to them so that they don't have to fight through. They know that they will not get through that fortress belt. And Zelensky has turned around and said he's not giving it up because he knows he can hold the Russians there. But a good question. One we will continue to analyse the whole way through. And then final question is it already too late for Britain to defend itself against Putin? Oh, I'd argue at one level, yes, it is too late. I'd argue at another level, no, it's not too late. Why is it too late? Well, Putin has been attacking us. He's been attacking us for the last 4 years. We have defences. We are defending ourselves. Our security services, GCHQ, our counter-terror police are working very hard and are stopping the majority of the attacks that are coming in, which is fantastic. Why do we not know about this? Because the success of the intelligence services and counter-terror police is measured by nothing happening. We know what's going on in the background. We get the reports. I've seen the reports. I've seen the activity. I know that the attacks are coming in virtually on a daily basis, but they're below the threshold. Every now and again, we get some that pop up. You know, they started even before the invasion of Ukraine, the polonium-210 attack on Alexander Litvinenko in London. the Novichok attack against Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury. But we've also seen Keir Starmer's own property attacked by individuals that were linked to Ukrainian nationals in an attempt to embarrass Keir Starmer. We've seen DHL warehouses with explosives found in the UK linked to the Russians. We've seen mysterious drones flying over US Air Force bases in the UK. There's a lot of activity going on. It's not always hitting the headlines. We are almost too late to defend against any potential conventional attack. We don't have a ballistic missile defense capability. We don't have a sufficient cruise missile defense capability. We couldn't defend against an Operation Spider's Web, those drones that came out of the top of containers on trucks where the Ukrainians attacked Russian strategic airfields. We have no defense against that. We need to step up when we need to step up fast. So is it ever too late? No, it's never too late to start, but we are vulnerable, very vulnerable. So that's it for this edition of Frontline. I think Jerome is back next week, so thank you for watching. Please, if you like what you've seen, share it amongst your friends. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell others to come and subscribe to the channel. But it's been a pleasure standing in for Jerome for the last couple of weeks. I'm Philip Ingram. Thank you. Goodbye.